All right, good morning, everybody. So, thanks for joining. I'm Ben Pitterle. I'm the Science and Policy Director for Santa Barbara Channelkeeper, and I think people are still logging in right now. So we're just going to wait a couple minutes and allow a few more people to join the conference. And this is great. I can see that there's a bunch of folks I know here. It's nice to see you all. Hey, Jenna. Yeah, Mark Cram. Hey, Mark. Hey, Larry. Bert, Paul. This is good. We got a good group here. All right. Well, I think we'll just get started here. So, like I said, good morning. I'm Ben Pitterle. I'm the Science and Policy Director for Santa Barbara Channelkeeper. Many of you I know, it looks like, and you live and work in the watershed. Some in attendance, I'm going to assume, might have only recently heard about Channelkeeper for the first time this year because of our work to restore flows to the river. And we've actually been involved. We've been doing work in the Ventura River watershed since 2001 in many capacities, and I'll speak really briefly to some of that in just a moment. But I think it's our litigation work against the City of Ventura to restore flows that I think really got a lot more people's attention. And no doubt, if you do live in the watershed, you're aware that the city initiated an adjudication of water rights last year, and the city connected its adjudication to Channelkeeper's lawsuit. And then it was really at that time that we at Channelkeeper began fielding a torrent of questions, concerns, many people in support of our work, and many feeling frustrated, and by and large, a lot of people confused about what Channelkeeper's role is in all of this. Why is Channelkeeper suing me, right? That's one of the main questions that we started hearing. And the truth, of course, is that Channelkeeper didn't sue anybody except the city to address a very specific issue related to its wells and its pumping at Foster Park. And I'll get into that in a moment. But there is a lot of background history there that I think people need an opportunity to learn about and understand Channelkeeper's role in all of this. So just a few months ago, I started doing a lot more outreach, and I was delivering presentations in Ojai and Ventura, and we were just really starting to expand our outreach about this issue when, of course, COVID happened. And so there's been a pause with some of that outreach for obvious reasons, but that's why we're doing this today. And we really want to be as open as possible with the entire community about how all of this started, what Channelkeeper's role is, what our goals are, and why this specifically became a priority issue for our organization. So I'm happy to talk about this issue today. There is going to be an opportunity at the end of the presentation to ask questions. I think each of you should have a tool somewhere on your screen there where you can type in questions. I have Laura Sanchez is my colleague at Channelkeeper, our communications director, and she'll be helping me field questions at the end of the presentation. And so, but I am going to hold off on getting to them until I have a chance to get through this whole thing. So if we run out of time and we don't get a chance to directly answer your question, I apologize. We have an hour here. But please do follow up via email. My email address is going to be posted at the end, and I'll try to get back to you, as soon as I can. So with that, And bear with me because I'm learning. Some of this technology is new to me as well. So here we go. So I'm gonna turn myself off here so you guys can see the full screen. So just a quick presentation outline. I'm just gonna talk about who Channelkeeper is. We're going to do a quick little virtual tour of the Ventura River. We'll be talking about groundwater and how groundwater is connected to the river. I'll be talking about some assessment that we performed on the City of Ventura's pumping impacts. And I'm going to go run through a timeline of events and talk a little bit more about why this all matters and kind of what our goals are. So Santa Barbara Channelkeeper, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Our mission is to protect and restore the Santa Barbara Channel and its watersheds through science-based advocacy, education, fieldwork, and enforcement. And so this right here, hopefully you guys can all see the cursor on my screen, but from Point Conception to the west to, let me see if I can move some of this from my screen here, to the Ventura River watershed on the east, on the front side or the south side of the Santa Ynez Mountains, and then the channel itself. This is the territory that Channelkeeper works within. So the Ventura River watershed is the sort of eastern boundary of where we do most of our work. Here, this is just an aerial view of the watershed. And actually, before I get into this, I think the first thing that we wanted to do here was to conduct just a couple of really quick polls just to help us better understand kind of the audience this morning. And so I think that one of my colleagues was going to queue up a poll. And so the first one here should have popped up for you. Do you live or work in the Ventura River watershed? So we'll just give this like 30 seconds and then. All right, so there we go. Looks like 75% do live in the watershed. That's great. And then for those that don't, we'll be doing, we have some slides and videos to kind of familiarize yourself with, this place that we'll be talking about. And then I had another question. If you guys want to queue up that second poll, we're just curious how many of you actually use the Ventura River to recreate. I think that should pop up soon. So have you ever recreated in the Ventura River or one of the local river preserves? All right, so it looks like pretty much the same results. So that's great. It's great that so many locals have joined us this morning, and then just bear with us and we'll pull the poll down. Okay, so this is an aerial view of the watershed. Let's move on to the next slide. For those who aren't from here, and even for those who are, we just have a really quick aerial tour of the watershed that we want to play through here. And I'll be speaking in more detail. Let's see, how do I make this go about some of these places? All right, so we start out first the mouth of the Ventura River at Surfers Point. Just a few miles upriver, we have the Ojai Valley Sanitary District's treatment plant and the City of Ventura's water purification plants. And then moving up just a mile or so from there, we have the Ventura Land Trust's Big Rock Preserve right next to Highway 33. It's the Ventura Highway. Just beyond that is Foster Park. And here we see some of the components of the city's well field, and I'll be speaking a lot more about this location momentarily. And then just kind of panning to the west, we have Lake Casitas. And now looking kind of due north up the river bed to the Ojai Valley. This is looking down at Foster Park and now kind of off to the south back towards the Pacific Ocean. City of Ventura, the west side. So moving up from Foster Park, there's a lot of open space in this stretch of river. And now we're at Casitas Springs, which is an important location. From this point down, historically, the river flows year round, and I'll talk more about that. San Antonio Creek confluence, this is where we start to see rising groundwater influence the river year round. And then as we keep going north, this stretch, and I'll talk more about it, but Highway 150, people are familiar with this view. This area of the river is known for more regularly going dry. There's the Robles Diversion Facility and Fish Ladder that diverts water from the river to Lake Casitas. And then, of course, at the top, off one of the two main tributaries, Matilaha Dam. And then looking back down at the Ojai Valley. So, great. Just super briefly, Channelkeeper's work in the river, it didn't begin with, our lawsuit against the city. Like I said, we've been working here for nearly 20 years. We have a robust educational partnership with local organizations, currently with Ventura Land Trust, Once Upon a Watershed, and we've partnered with these groups, and we've worked on our own as well to deliver environmental science based curriculum to local schools of all levels. If anybody's heard of Channelkeeper before recently, it may have been likely due to our work monitoring water quality in the watershed. So our Stream Team Citizen Monitoring Program, it's been up and running since 2001. We've worked in partnership with Surfrider Foundation, Ventura County chapter since that time, and each month, basically volunteers divide up into teams. They take water quality samples and measurements at up to 15 locations throughout the watershed, and the data it's been utilized and referred to for a number of different purposes over the years. This is a map of groundwater basins in the watershed, and we'll be talking a bit about groundwater this morning. So there are officially 4 basins in the watershed. There's the lower basin there shown in brown. At the bottom, the upper basin in yellow, and this is the area that this presentation will focus primarily on. There's the Ojai Basin underneath the city of Ojai, and then there's also an upper Ojai Basin that actually extends somewhat into the neighboring watershed. This is a map of the river from its headwaters to the ocean, and as you can see, the different sections of the river have been categorized as either perennial or intermittent in various watershed studies. So these perennial reaches, the upper section coming out of the pass leading to Matilaha Canyon, that flows year-round, as well as the lower half of the river from about Casitas Springs, the community of Casitas Springs on down. And the middle upper section there in orange, that's what many in the area are familiar with because you get such good view of those areas from some of the bridges, the Highway 150 bridge and the river preserve. And this section is known to be intermittent. It may or may not be flowing, but just because the middle portion of the river goes dry, it doesn't mean that the lower river shouldn't be flowing, and I'll explain why. It has to do with what's underground with the geology. So what we're looking at here is a cross section of what's beneath the ground. And this is an old depiction. Currently, local agencies are developing a more refined picture of what these basins look like. But this figure is still helpful, I think, as a way to help us understand why the river flows all year round in some areas and not in others. And so this is a simplification. It's not exactly how things work, partly because this is two-dimensional, right? But it's still helpful. So this upriver is to the right, downriver in the Pacific Ocean is to the left. The lowest layer of geology shown here in gray, that's the bedrock layer. And this is what confines the water above it. So that's to say that it's impermeable, right? And so water can't sink below it. Above the bedrock there in pink is a layer of mixed alluvium, which is made up of boulders and cobblestones and sand, silt and gravel, and that's the layer that stores water underground. In other words, that's the basin that we use to pump water from underground. And that's our groundwater supply, and it's shown there in purple. You can see that the elevation of the bedrock layer changes as we move from right to left, as does the thickness of the alluvium above it. So here in blue, this is water flow. So here we have water flowing from the upper tributaries, from the upper river, over the Robles diversion near the very top of the basin. The Robles diversion is what diverts water to Lake Casitas during certain times of year, right? And as water flows into the basin during certain times of year, it sinks underground. And here, these little squiggly lines, they represent water sinking beneath the surface. And so I like to use this example. It's just like if you had a bathtub that was full of sand, right? And you turn on the faucet and water starts filling up the tub. And so at first the water is going to sink into the sand, right? And you'd keep adding water until the sand was fully saturated with water, or maybe just like watering like a flower pot or something. You add water until the pot or the tub or the basin in this instance is fully saturated, and then water flows over the surface. You have standing water, or a river in this instance. So, but now imagine putting a big straw in that tub that's connected to a pump, and you start pumping water from out of that sand layer, and you turn up the pump so that you're pumping water at a rate that is pumping water out faster than the faucet is pouring into it. What would happen, right? The surface water would disappear. There's still water underground or underneath that sand, but you know, in the case of our river, the river dries up. And that's what can sometimes happen and be caused by groundwater pumping. And in the upper river basin, we have two of our local major water districts. We have Miners Oaks and Ventura River water districts that operate well fields there. And there are other wells there as well. And during some years or certain times of year, during certain times of some years, this stretch of the river goes dry, depending on how much water is coming into it from upstream, right? How much water is being pumped, and also how the underground geology is oriented. And that's again where this bedrock layer comes into play, because we can see right here, right about at that confluence where San Antonio Creek comes in, the bedrock rises in elevation, and what it does is it pushes all the groundwater flowing down gradient underground back up to the surface, and we have a flowing river again, where the water springs to the surface. And that's why they call this Casitas Springs, because at that location in the river, from that point down, historically, we've had a perennially flowing river. So downstream of Casitas Springs, we have Foster Park, and the City of Ventura's well field is located there. And it's here that in some years, depending on the amount of water that's coming in from upstream and the amount of pumping that's occurring, the city's pumping can directly impact flows, and in worst cases can completely dry up the river, which otherwise would be flowing in that location. So just to make sure everybody understands, there is such thing as a confined aquifer, right, where the groundwater is separated from the surface by some impermeable layer like bedrock. But in our situation, the groundwater is directly connected to the river. So when you pump out of the ground, there is a potential to impact the river. So again, just to orient people one last time on an aerial view of the watershed. So here at the top, this is where the Ventura River starts, at the confluence of Matilaha Creek and the North Fork of Matilaha Creek. And then this is Casitas Springs, where springs surface and provide year-long flows to the river. This is the Foster Park well field. And this is approximately the stretch of river that should flow year-round. And unfortunately, this isn't, water flowing year-round. This isn't always the case. So this is a photo of Foster Park. This is actually an underground dam. So what we're looking at is the top of of a wall, essentially, that the city built many years ago at Foster Park, basically to create a bathtub effect, to back up the water, the groundwater behind it, to enhance its capacity to pump. And so here you can see that the groundwater has been depleted such that the downstream portion of the river has gone totally dry. And here's another view of that same location later in the year where, as you can see, the river, it's bone dry at Foster Park. And this was a condition that we observed throughout much of the recent drought. And so you may be asking yourselves, right? So how do you know that pumping is contributing to the river being dry, and that this isn't just because due to the drought there isn't any groundwater to spring to the surface and create flows? And that's a really good question, right? We had the same question, which is why we spent a lot of time and energy looking at pumping records and river flow data. And this graph here helps us answer that question. So what we have here is a graph that shows daily river flow in blue, alongside daily pumping in orange. And we added precipitation there in green as well, just to try to tease out blips or pulses in flow that would be related to rainfall rather than pumping. But this graph shows a pretty brief period, the period from March through June 2016. And we looked specifically at this period because during this time, the river went dry at Foster Park. It was actually dry earlier in the year until we got a storm. But here you can see around the second half of March, the river was essentially dry. And what happened was that we had some of our volunteers were out on the bike path in April, and they had just been out the week before and it was dry, and all of a sudden they're riding their bikes by and they see that the river's flowing with water. And so they email us and they're like, the river's flowing, the river's flowing. And, we hadn't had any recent rain since it had been dry. And it begged the question, did something change with the city's pumping at that time that could have been the cause of the river coming back to life? And so through Public Records Act requests, which the city responded to, we examined pumping effort during that period. And what we discovered is, in fact, there is a very direct relationship between pumping and river flow. And you can see that here, just right here on this day, right when pumping, that orange line was turned off, the river flow, the blue line, it shot right back up. So the river went from dry to fully flowing in just a matter of days when the city's wells were turned off. And just remember, this is the city's own data that we're looking at. So then the flow data is straight from the USGS flow gauge at Foster Park. So this is all public agency data. And then you can see about 2 weeks later or so, when the city's pumping resumed, we instantly see an immediate and sharp decline in river flow. And then a day or so later, pumping is slightly reduced, and you see a corresponding increase in river flow. And then again in June, we see that the pumping was increased, and that increase was what it took for flows in the river to fall sharply until the river went dry again. And if we were to stretch this graph out and show the years and years of data that is available, you'd see that this wasn't a random anomaly. What happened during these months, this river flows at Foster Park are directly impacted by city pumping, much more so in low flow periods, right? Not as much when there's plenty of water. But to that extent, the city's operations can make a difference between a flowing river and a totally dry riverbed. And then just to reiterate, this isn't Channelkeeper data. This is publicly available data from local agencies. So the city pumps water from the Ventura River or its basin. It's basically the same thing. We've covered that now. But what limits are there on the city's pumping? What requirements are placed on the city to regulate the amount of water that it takes to make sure that the river isn't detrimentally impacted? And the answer is zero. There are currently no regulatory restrictions on the city's pumping to protect the environment. In terms of water rights, I want to show this slide just to sort of illustrate the state of the city's water rights. So on the left here, we have in acre feet, the City of Ventura's highest annual groundwater production from Foster Park from 2000 to present. So the most it's ever pumped from that period was a little over 5,000 acre feet. Lately, they've been pumping, it's been less than that. That's the most since 2000. The total estimated average groundwater pumping from all pumpers in the basin, so that's everybody, is a little over 9,000 acre feet per year. This third column, so this is a poor estimate, but currently the most official number we have in terms of capacity of the upper basin is a little over 35,000 acre feet. So that's according to the Department of Water Resources. I expect that number will be refined in the near future with all the various studies that are going on right now. But currently the maximum amount of water that the basin can hold is officially 35,000 acre feet. And then this last column on the right, this is the city's existing water right. So the City of Ventura has a claim to over 72,000 acre feet of water per year, right? So all of this is only to illustrate that the current state of water rights have no actual bearing on reality, yet alone what may or may not impact the ecosystems, you know, or other public trust resources. And just to reiterate, there have been zero restrictions to date placed on pumping for the purpose of protecting the environment. But let's talk briefly about other water rights and pumping capacity. So, you know, how much water the city can actually pump if water is available to pump, because we also wanted to know, how does the city's pumping compare to the amount of water everyone else takes? And the answer to that is that the city is by far the biggest pumper in the basin. It's so big that even if all municipal pumping from other users in the basin were to disappear overnight, the city still has enough pumping capacity to consume all the water that would be left behind. So here we looked at, and we looked at a number of different scenarios. This is just one of them, but if during the drought from 2014 through 2016, Miners Oaks Water District and Ventura River Water Districts, remember their wells are upstream of the cities near Highway 150. If they didn't pump any water in these years, if they just magically disappeared, would there be enough water left behind so that the river would flow? Assuming that the city would pump as much as it can from the river. And remember, the river is the city's best and cheapest source of water. So it maximizes, and they say this publicly, right? They maximize what they can get from the river. Its only limitation is whether or not water is available and the size of its pumps. So the answer to that question we ask is that the city could have actually taken every drop that was left behind. So just to look at this graph more closely, this red line here, that's the city's existing pumping capacity. It's about 4,200 acre feet per year. So the orange portion of these columns, this is the amount of water the city actually pumped those years. The blue portion represents what other water districts pumped those years from this basin. So you can already see that the city pumps more water than both the other water districts combined. In all three of these years, the city could have pumped all that water that was left behind and still had surplus capacity to pump, meaning that the river would still most likely have been dry even if these two districts magically disappeared overnight. And this tells us that clearly the city's well operations, they're critical, right, in determining whether or not the river will flow. And that's not to say that the upstream pumpers don't also affect river flows. It just means that if we were to prioritize which users have the most direct and overarching impact on the river, it would be the City of Ventura. Okay, so we've talked about there not being any existing restrictions on the city's pumping. The National Marine Fisheries Service did try once to impose restrictions on city pumping to protect steelhead trout. So what happened was in 2005, we had a big El Nino event. Many of us remember. The city's well field at Foster Park was damaged and it needed to do repairs. But to do the repairs, they initially wanted to put heavy equipment in the riverbed, and that triggered a permit process. At that time, the National Marine Fisheries Service assessed the impact of the city's continued pumping on endangered steelhead trout, and they determined that the city's continued pumping was likely to jeopardize the continued existence of the Southern California DPS, and that's jargon, but it means the Southern California population of steelhead trout, and is likely to destroy or adversely modify critical habitat for this species. So the agency was prepared to permit the repairs anyways at that time by offering what they call a reasonable and prudent alternative. And again, that's jargon, but what they recommended was that the city implement a plan to alter well field operations such that the quantity of water withdrawn by the well field does not result in surface discharge or flow, in other words, at Foster Park falling below 11 to 12 cubic feet per second. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. But based on available information at that time, the agency decided that 12 CFS was the critical threshold that is protective of steelhead trout. And that doesn't mean that the river wouldn't fall below that naturally or due to other pumping. It just means that below 12 CFS, the city would have to cease pumping in order to protect what river flows are actually available. So was this implemented? No, it wasn't. These conditions were never imposed, and the city rather, they figured out a way to do the necessary repairs without needing a permit, and no restrictions were put in place. In 2013, the city contracted with a hydrologist. So they hired a consultant in part to examine impacts of its pumping on steelhead trout. And their own consultant at that time concluded that there is, quote, a dynamic relationship between surface water flows and groundwater diversions in the Foster Park reach of the river. The findings of this study indicate a flow threshold exists whereby when flows decrease below the threshold, the habitat suitability declines significantly. And they did this by looking at primarily oxygen levels in the river. So when flows diminish, oxygen disappears and no longer fully supports wildlife. Just to reiterate, again, this is the city's own study. But the study concluded with a recommendation that the city consider reducing its diversion rates during the dry season as river flows decline to 2 cubic feet per second. So the city's own consultant recommends at a minimum reducing pumping when flows reach 2 CFS or less. And so a lot of people don't, as I've given this presentation in the past, people want to know what that looks like. What does a cubic foot per second look like? So this is a really quick video. It shows you the comparison. So this is approximately 12 cubic feet per second. And, you know, for most of us who live in this area, we would consider this, right? That's a fully flowing, healthy river. And this is what 2 cubic feet per second look like. Just to help orient people for perspective. So a key question, right, is has the city operated its pumping in a responsible manner based on what it has heard from federal agencies and its own consultants? And so this figure answers that question. And there's a lot of numbers here, but it's actually pretty simple because it's just the colors that matter. And so each big outlined box here represents a year of pumping and river flow at Foster Park. And you can see, excuse me, you can see the calendar months across the top. The rows, these are all the city's wells and diversions at Foster Park. It has a number of wells and that it operates there. The number in each box is how much water in acre feet was pumped from each well during that month of the year. And so, and then this is where it gets interesting because the light blue months the columns that are light blue, those are months where river flow was less than 12 CFS for the entire month, okay? And as you can see, the city still pumped a lot of water from these sources, even though flows were below what National Marine Fisheries Service said was adequate for endangered species. Now, the dark blue months, those are months in which flows were less than 2 CFS for the entire month. And again, as you can see, the city continued to pump when flows were less than 2 CFS, but as we keep going, we can see that throughout almost the entirety of 2012 and 2013, that the city operated its wells, even though the river was below these thresholds. And then in 2014, the orange months here, those were months in which the river was totally dry. It was bone dry for the entire month. And as you can see, the city still pumped water from underneath the river, from the ground. 2015, 2016, you can see the city continues to pump as much water as it possibly can from the river, even through the drought, even after surface flows have disappeared entirely. And so we determined in 2015 that, contrary to its messaging, the city had not been a steward of the river. They didn't listen to the National Marine Fisheries Service. They didn't listen to their own consultant, and some form of intervention was needed. So here I'm going to run through a brief timeline of events, and I think it's important to have this here for people to be able to understand how we got to where we are now. I've seen some of the presentations the cities given their timeline. Their timeline always starts with Channelkeeper sues the city, but that's not where this actually began by any means. So I'm going to start in 1998 was actually when the state of California formally recognized at that time that the Ventura River was impaired by excessive pumping and diversions. In 2007, we went over this. The National Marine Fisheries Service tried to regulate pumping at Foster Park, but they were circumvented. It was around 2010 that Channelkeeper and others in the watershed began advocating in local community forums, for the city to address overpumping and for state agencies to intervene. In 2013, the city's consultant hydrology report concluded that its pumping was detrimental to endangered species. In 2014 was when Channelkeeper filed legal action in state court against the State Water Resources Control Board primarily, and the City of Ventura. But the purpose was to compel the state to intervene and initiate a process that would balance the city's water supply needs with other public trust resources. And we tried at that time immediately to try to initiate settlement negotiations with the city, as we did throughout the next 5 years to minimize legal costs. The city responded by choosing to petition to have the lawsuit dismissed. That was denied after a court hearing, and by filing cross complaints. Sorry, there's a bunch of birds outside. And by filing cross complaints against other water right holders in the watershed. And so this was a pivotal moment, because this is when the city first attempts to bring in other water rights holders into Channelkeeper's lawsuit. And so Channelkeeper opposed the city's cross complaints. And I want to be clear about why we did this. The city argued that everyone else in the watershed was needed to figure out when it needed to turn on or off its pumps. We argued that no, flows are what they are at any given point at Foster Park due to drought or pumping or a combination of both. But what we're seeking is a threshold where the city has to reduce or stop its own pumping to protect the river. We don't need a room, right? We don't need a room full of 100 lawyers to set that number. Now, do other pumpers affect what water is available for the city to pump? Absolutely they do. And does the city have a legal right to challenge other water right holders to protect its ability to pump? Yes, they have that right. But our view is that that was a separate process. And the city could negotiate, or they could litigate, or do whatever it felt it needed to do in regards to other water right holders. But that process was not essential to developing limits on the city's own pumping. So for that reason, we opposed the city's cross complaints. We knew that the process would drag on and it would be costly. And we viewed it as a way to bog down our efforts to address the city's pumping at Foster Park. So just to move on with the timeline. April 2015, the state Superior Court sided with Channelkeeper. They dismissed the city's cross complaints. The city responded by appealing. February 2016, Channelkeeper provided oral public comments to the city council, encouraging the council to enter into settlement negotiations rather than approving an additional $978,000 to fight Channelkeeper's litigation. The city council unanimously voted to approve the spending to fight Channelkeeper rather than addressing degradation of the river. April 2018, after a lengthy process, the appellate court sided with Ventura. The cross complaints were allowed to move forward. So keep in mind, it's important to keep this in mind. This entire time, the river's been going dry and it's been dying. September 2018, the City of Ventura chose to file an amended cross complaint against all other water right holders in the watershed, and they issued their notice of commencement of adjudicatory proceedings. Spring of 2019, Channelkeeper enters into mediated settlement negotiations with the city. I'll get into more detail about that in one moment. And we did that as a formal party to the adjudication now. And it was September in 2019 that Channelkeeper and the city signed an interim settlement agreement. So the interim settlement agreement, a couple things to highlight. The agreement bound the city for a period of 164 days to reduce or possibly halt pumping in the event that winter rains were insufficient to maintain certain minimum flow levels. 2 CFS was the cutoff. The city must implement a small number of habitat improvement projects at Foster Park. Channelkeeper's claims for future excessive pumping or unreasonable use of water from the river remain active after that 164-day period and until the stipulated adjudication is finalized. A lot of people want to talk about this. $875,000 were provided to Channelkeeper as fee recovery for the legal firm representing Channelkeeper and outside experts. I want to point out, Channelkeeper we don't have in-house attorneys. We don't have attorneys that are accruing, legal hours that the organization is billing for. Legal representation was provided to Channelkeeper on a contingency basis. That means that the firm that represented us agreed to forego payment until fees were awarded or negotiated through settlement. Thousands of hours of staff time, volunteer time, and monitoring expenses were fully funded by private individual donations and foundation grants. And I want to remind everyone that Channelkeeper, we tried to negotiate settlement from the very beginning to limit legal expenses for that entire 5-year period. And I just want to make clear, Channelkeeper sued for water. We sued to get water back in the Ventura River. And that's why we did this. I'm proud of our work, and I'm proud to be a part of an organization, frankly, that chose to take a stand and protect the river. And unfortunately, legal action is what it took for this issue to be adequately addressed. But no one at Channelkeeper is getting rich off of this litigation, I promise. And if you don't believe me, you should look at the truck I'm driving. So moving forward, So Channelkeeper, we're now a formal party to the adjudication along with the State Water Board and Department of Fish and Wildlife. Adjudication, it's essentially when the court intervenes to assess all rights and reallocate them based on the actual present condition. Our role moving forward is to participate in that process with the sole intent of ensuring that the final outcome provides adequate water for public trust resources, which include endangered species, but other wildlife and other beneficial uses of the river. And then our intent is also to ensure that adequate flows are provided for the river until that final outcome is determined. So as we move through this process, and so that interim flow requirements, that 164-day agreement that has expired now, those will need to be renegotiated. And then this is the final portion of my presentation. This is actually my favorite part, and we're almost done here, but I just want to speak briefly about why we're doing this. And you might have noticed that I didn't really talk very much about steelhead trout. They came up when we were talking about the National Marine Fisheries Service, and steelhead are the subject of a lot of attention most of the time for obvious reasons, right? Because they're an endangered species, and a lot of our laws are triggered and they're driven by endangered species. But Channelkeeper's not doing this just to protect a single species of fish. In fact, you know, I rarely really focus on steelhead trout when I present, because I think that that's a disservice to what we're actually trying to do. And what we're actually trying to do is to protect an entire ecosystem. And here, these are just a few photos of, you know, just a few of the types of animals that depend on the Ventura River. This is an entire ecosystem, and it's an ecosystem that exists in our own backyards and that we alone are responsible for degrading, right? This isn't some river that runs for, you know, hundreds or thousands of miles where someone else upstream is responsible for degrading it. It's just us. And the people using water from this river live in this watershed, and it's our responsibility to take care of. It's no one else's. And it's not just about plants and animals, right? By no means is this only about environmental concerns that are, you know, separate from ourselves, because this community used to be strongly connected to the river directly as a source of sustenance, like you see here in these historic photos. There are lots of them. They're really cool. And I'm not suggesting that we're trying to bring back steelhead at this point just so people can fish for them, right? But there was a time, and it was only 2 generations ago, when the community did recognize the value that the river provided in a very direct way in terms of sustenance and recreation. And there are a lot of photos around the area. I like the ones at Jim and Rob's, the restaurant, the best. They've got a lot of cool ones up on their wall. But there was a time when, you know, I talk about this sometimes, but every street off Ventura Avenue had a trail at the end that led to the river. And every day, you know, if you talk to the old timers that are from around here, you know, they talk about every day after work or school and every weekend, people went to the river, and there were swimming holes that all had unique names, and people fished and they boated and they swam, and the river was a part of their home. And it still is today. So this is my family, and I can't tell you how many times we've visited the river just in the last year, and what this place means to us as a part of this place that we consider our home. And just my final slides, I don't even think I really need these anymore. I think because since COVID, I think we all understand how important it is to have outdoor places that we can access for recreation, for physical and mental healing, right? And we've seen that on the Ventura River like never before recently, right? It's actually become a management issue because so many people are seeking the river at this time. But these are time-lapse photos from a short project we had back in 2013. And we had a few cameras up around the watershed for the purpose of monitoring flow fluctuations over time. And this camera was located at Foster Park for about 60 days. And when we got the photos back, it wasn't the water fluctuations at this time that struck us. Rather, it was how heavily this part of the river is used by our local community members. And here, this is just one photo from each day, but you can see that every weekend people came here and they used the river for outdoor recreation. So we have March 24th, March 30th, March 31st, April 5th, April 6th, April 7th, the 14th, the 20th, 21st, 28th, and then into May 4th and 5th. And you can see that these are members of our local community that use the river as this is their access to nature. And it's important to protect that. And frankly, this is an environmental justice issue. And we need to start thinking about it that way and not pretending that the only thing, drying up the river impacts is one species of fish. And this is my last slide, and it's just a couple photos of the Upper River Preserve from a couple weekends before Memorial Day. And I know the crowds became an issue, and there was a littering problem that we also tried to help address. And we need to work on managing these river access areas to make sure that people are enjoying them in a responsible manner. But honestly, these photos, they warm my heart, because these are photos from of people from all walks of life using the Ventura River. These are families, bringing their families to enjoy and to recreate. And once the community is connected and recognizes the value of a place, it starts protecting that place. And this place is worth protecting. We lost that in large part because the river has been so degraded in the past. And that's what we're trying to reverse. And so that's why I'm doing this work. That's why Channelkeeper is taking a stand for the river. And it's not just about, steelhead trout. It's about, this is our home. So I think, so that's the end of the presentation, and I'm gonna open it up to questions now. I'm gonna turn myself back on. I'm not sure if you guys can see me, but so I think Laura was going to chime in here.
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, everyone. I'm Ben's colleague. So as we turn to the question and answer portion of the webinar, you're welcome to type your inquiries in the question field of the control panel. And then I'm going to share them with Ben out loud, just for simplicity's sake. So take a few moments and feel free to enter your questions. And I wanted to reiterate that if we don't get to your question, we'll follow up after the webinar via email. And then subsequently, if you have additional questions, feel free to reach out to Ben or me via email. Okay, let's see. So Ben, the first one is, what accounts for the fluctuations in the city's pumping volume? Or more simply, why did they turn the pump off?
Well, generally the city prioritizes getting water from the river. They're limited by their capacity to pump. They're limited by how much water is available there. So they can't, they can only produce so much if there's not a ton of water in the river. As to why they may sometimes increase or decrease, that I don't have that operational background, of the city's, pumping. Occasionally, I know that they have performed tests in the past to look at how pumping does or doesn't impact river flows, and I imagine there are other operational just reasons why periodically they increase or decrease pumping.
Great. Then the next one is, what are the other water districts upstream from Ventura?
Well, there are a number of water districts in the watershed. The two primary municipal water districts pumpers would be Miners Oaks and the Ventura River Water District. Of course, Casitas Municipal Water District, right, is is a huge component of the local water supply. Lake Casitas relies on diversions. There's a dam on Coyote Creek, right? And then water is also diverted from the Ventura River during high flow periods to Lake Casitas. Lake Casitas does have some wells, or the Casitas Water District does have some wells, and I believe now that they're taking over operations for Golden State, that there may be other wells that they're responsible for as well. But in the upper Ventura River Basin, it's really just those few water districts.
Great. Then the next one is, how does this dovetail with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife in-stream flow study?
Yeah, great question. And this is where it gets complicated, because there are a number of parallel processes moving forward. Let's see, 2015, I think I have that right, California adopted the Water Action Plan. In that document, they selected the Ventura River as one of 5 priority rivers where they were going to invest state resources to address lack of flows for endangered salmonids or steelhead trout in this case. And so part of that is that the Department of Fish and Wildlife comes in, and they are doing a number of studies to determine what the flow requirements are to protect steelhead trout and functioning ecosystems. They began that process doing surveys a number of years ago. Very recently, they released a criteria report, which, as I understand it, is just the initial phase of kind of vetting the results. The criteria report is just, they ran the numbers they had through a number of established models, and they got results that they've presented. Some of those models are more or less suited for this area, but it's just the modeling results. They're not formal recommendations yet. That's the next step. So the Fish and Wildlife is working closely with the State Water Resources Control Board, that's also doing modeling. They're looking at relationships between surface water and groundwater, and I believe that they plan to release formal recommendations by the end of the year. And then hopefully when the state's model is out, these will be tools that we can use to figure out how much water is needed and how does that translate into groundwater management, and then how can everybody collaboratively or conjunctively manage groundwater as a resource to leave functional flows behind for the Ventura River.
Excellent. Then the next question is, what's next with the city's adjudication?
So the city, some in attendance may have heard that the city filed for an extension from the court to allow more time for water right holders to respond, right, and to decide whether or not they wanted to participate or not. And during that period, they've said that their intent has been to continue negotiations with the other primary water right holders to figure out a way to resolve this issue without having to undergo a lengthy adjudication process. They've communicated that in the past, that they've been optimistic that they were close to an agreement. I guess what I can say, and I think this is important for people to understand, is that I don't know how close they are or not. And I don't know that because Channelkeeper or the State Water Board and Department of Fish and Wildlife. We have not been a part of those negotiations. And so I think there's frankly a lot more negotiation and discussion that's going to need to happen. I'm not sure exactly how that can even take place or be finalized before we have all of the science, right? Because our intent is to base our recommendations on the best available science, and that's still being developed. So we'll see. I know that the process is still moving forward, and there are discussions happening. I know that from Channelkeeper's perspective, our priority is to secure another commitment from the city to preserve interim flows in the river. We're headed into summer, and we're worried that, you know, we don't want the river to dry up again, and we want enough water left behind that adequately protects the ecosystem. So I'll leave it at that. It looks like we're at 12:01. I don't know, Laura, how many more questions are there?
There are quite a few more questions, but it looks like there are a couple that we could sort of loop together, maybe to create one last question.
Sure.
So the question is, how does the Ojai Basin affect flows at Foster Park? And is water being transported by the city outside the Ventura watershed? Maybe you can address both of those together.
Yeah, sure. The Ojai Basin is connected to the Ventura River. It's connected primarily through San Antonio Creek. So right around Camp Comfort, there's a similar kind of bedrock feature where the bedrock rises and you get surfacing groundwater that maintains flows in San Antonio Creek throughout most of the year. Now the Ojai Basin it's very different from the Upper Ventura River Basin, and that is much deeper. The Ventura River Basin is pretty shallow. It's only, I don't know, I think at its deepest it's on average, some of you on this meeting know better than I, but somewhere between like 150, 200 feet deep. It's not very deep. At Foster Park, it's like 50 feet or less. It's very shallow. Ojai Basin is much deeper. And so does a gallon of water pumped from deep in the Ojai Basin affect as directly the Ventura River as a gallon of water pumped out of Foster Park? No, I don't believe that to be the case. However, those are questions that are still being studied, and those answers are, you know, as some of these modeling efforts move forward, I think we'll have a better understanding of how the Ojai Basin is connected to the river. It is connected. And the other question about does the city pump or move water outside of the watershed? Yeah, I really don't want to get myself in trouble by misspeaking here. I believe that there may be a portion of the kind of west side community outside of the watershed that is serviced, but by Ventura River water. But yeah, I'm gonna say don't hold me accountable for that answer, and that's something that you know, I can clarify with some of the water agencies.
Great, thanks so much. So then the rest of the questions we'll be able to address via email.
All right. Well, that's what I have this morning, and just thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. Please do reach out. You know, I want to hear your thoughts and concerns, and I promise we'll try to be as responsive as possible. And then also feel free to share this webinar. I believe that this is recorded. I think that's correct, Laura, right?
That's
Yeah.
correct. There are also some handouts in the handout section in your control panel at the right, with the timeline and some PDFs of helpful resources.
All right. Okay, well, everybody, yeah, thanks and enjoy the rest of your day, and look forward to seeing many of you soon. Take care.